Well, welcome everybody. My name is Bob Truby. I'm the director of the Emerging Scholars Network, and we're so happy that you could join us today for this ESN conversation. We have, I think, a very special time today in conversation with Diana Gruver, who has just released a new book called Companions in the Darkness. And before we begin, I just want to mention one thing here. This conversation is going to be recorded. And if you would prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please mute your mic and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video and or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. I'm actually going to stop recording for a moment here to allow you to disable your video and audio if you prefer not to be recorded. Just a few things about Diana, and she'll probably tell us more about herself as well. Diana has an MA from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. She writes a lot about discipleship and spiritual formation in the everyday. She serves as a writer and communications director for the Veer Institute and lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and daughter. So I won't say a whole lot more. You'll learn more about her in the course of our conversation. So I bring Diana on here. Okay, Diane, hey, anyhow, we are very happy to have you in our conversation today, and particularly we're excited because this is launch day for you.
It is.
The book, Companions in the Darkness, was officially released today, and so we are especially honored to have you on release day. To talk about the book, and very happy you could join us. It's really a privilege for us to be able to interview you. Diana, I wonder if you could just tell us to begin with a little bit about how you came to write the book.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I have a degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. It's in spiritual formation. And the program there is heavily weighted in church history. So that's where I first started to hear some of these stories. I've personally struggled with depression myself. And I think whenever you've walked through something like that, you start to notice that cropping up in other people's stories. So whenever I first started to notice that, it captured my interest. And I couldn't help but wonder why I had never heard these stories before, and if I had known them before I first walked through depression, maybe how my experience might have been different. So I set out just researching some of these initial folks that popped up. Two of the first ones were Martin Luther and Charles Spurgeon. And then eventually that led to this book as a whole.
Wow, that's kind of fun. Yeah, well, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you determined who you profiled in the book. What were the signs of depression that you saw in these people's lives, or at least how did you pick these people?
So there's a challenge in church history of what voices are preserved. So that was one of the challenges, is what stories that I have access to. Depression has had a stigma attached to it in a lot of segments of church history. So there are some people that maybe struggled but didn't write much about it, or those stories were not preserved for us. We obviously also have the challenge that a lot of the most preserved voices are white men. So trying to find some other voices there of women and people of color was a challenge. And I also wanted to spread them out throughout history to have a representation across several centuries. So those were some of the things that I was looking for. Another thing was I didn't want this book to be one that I had to make a case that each of these people was depressed. I wanted it to be fairly self-evident. So looking for fairly obvious symptoms of what we now call clinical depression so that was something that we could just, I could share their story and we could pull some advice from them, but I didn't need to construct some kind of major historical argument that this
Sure.
person was depressed. So for a lot of them that are in this book, they explicitly talk about their depression, and many of them call it that by name. At the time, they would have called it melancholy, but many of them were pretty upfront about that struggle in their own lives.
That's a great word, by the way, melancholy. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, you said that the signs of depression are fairly self-evident, and they even reference them. What are the telltale signs of depression, particularly for our audience, as you think about others who you may know, or even in your own life? What are some of the things that signal that you might be facing depression?
One of the ones that I think is the most well known is a pervading sense of sadness.
Mm-hmm.
But depression is more than just extreme sadness. So it also brings with it a loss of interest in things you once enjoyed. Maybe you're no longer interested in your work, or there's a hobby you're no longer interested in. A sense of worthlessness. It can have physical symptoms to it. A lot of times it affects people's sleep. Either they sleep too much or not enough. The same with eating habits. They might overeat or undereat. And it just has this big cloud over and a fog over your whole life that, life is no longer exciting. It's a lot of drudgery. And there's this sense of just exhaustion and fatigue that comes with it. So I think those are some of the big ones that pop up most often for people.
Well, you had a number of interesting people in your book that you wrote about. There's Martin Luther and David Brainerd and Charles Spurgeon, Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King Jr. But one of the ones that I thought was particularly interesting, because I'd never heard of her before, was Hannah Allen. Tell us about Hannah Allen and how you chose to include her in the book.
So I actually stumbled upon Hannah Allen in a book about the history of eating disorders. I do not for the life of me remember why I picked that up, but there was her story, and I thought it was worth including, because you're right, she is a bit more obscure. And with my love of just how we work out our discipleship in everyday life, I appreciated her story because I think she represents that, just of an everyday Christian wrestling through her struggles and her relationship with God. But she lived during the 17th century in England. We know her story from a spiritual autobiography that was published after her death that tells her story of struggling with depression and attempts at suicide after the death of her husband. And her story, I think, is particularly interesting because she struggled from something that then would have been called religious melancholy. So it's depression, but with a specifically religious fixation. So she believed that she had committed an unpardonable sin. And she said at one point that the devil would be a saint compared to her. And so not only did she experience some of the other feelings of depression and the bodily symptoms that come with depression, she also had this very strong sense of this depression in her spiritual life as well. But reading her story and how people around her tried to support her and encourage her, I think it's really encouraging and really helpful for us today to realize that even though she did have this religious obsession, some might say, in the midst of her depression, they didn't treat her depression as if it was just a spiritual problem. They understood it to be a problem of an imbalance in her body and a breakdown of her body. So they tried to treat her with medical care available at the day. They put her on suicide watch. They changed her environment and just kept company with her until she came out of that season of depression. So I think, especially as depression is still mishandled sometimes in that way, I think her story, especially with the religious bent that came with her depression, can offer a corrective to that.
Well, one of the one of the things that's interesting is that none of the people you profile had access to the modern medications or treatments that we use for depression. And I wonder, what did you learn about how they coped without those kinds of measures?
So I think they incorporated a lot of the lifestyle things that we know are helpful today in conjunction with medication and therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So Martin Luther, for example, advised people to flee solitude, which is hard advice to follow when you're depressed because
Yeah.
it makes you want to withdraw. But he would tell people being alone is one of the worst things you can do. You need to be with other people who will help pull you out of the cycle of your own negative thoughts. Others like Martin Luther King Jr. found help through, ironically enough, humor and his faith and the power of music to remind himself of hope. And Charles Spurgeon also, I think he found in scripture kind of an anchor really in the promises of God that even though that, the Bible did not cure his depression, it was still invaluable for him in the midst of it because it reminded him of what was true regardless of his own feelings. So I think things like that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And as I've gotten to know these companions, I've tried to incorporate some of those things into my own life.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Spurgeon, and Spurgeon kind of came as a surprise to me because, I think at one point Spurgeon said something to the effect that, people were criticizing him for his humor. And he says, "You should know what I don't say," or something to that effect. And, given that, I was very surprised to learn of his depression. Can you say a little more about his experience of depression? And because that's a whole face of Spurgeon that I don't think most of us have ever been exposed to who know anything about him.
Yeah, which I think is surprising because he talks about it pretty openly in some of his sermons and in some of his
Okay.
writings. He actually, some of the lectures that he gave to the students in his pastor's college are preserved. There's a volume of those lectures. And one of them is actually about preparing them for when depression might strike and what to do. It's called The Minister's Fainting Fits. Yeah, his depression came and went throughout his life. There were certain seasons that were particularly difficult. One of his seasons of depression, one of the most crippling ones, came after the Surrey Gardens music hall disaster, where there were several people killed while he was preaching there. And that sent him into a very deep depression. The elders of his church and his wife wondered if he would ever be able to preach again. He was just very out of it, very, very depressed. And so it came and went throughout his life. He had some physical illnesses that played with it as well. He suffered intensely from gout. But he used that suffering to shape him as a pastor. And so he would tell people from the pulpit, you can't just tell people to snap out of it. He said once that people think they can improve other people's nerves by, jolting them out of it. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And so he would urge people to have compassion and understanding, just as God had compassion on them. And so in that sense, I wish that I could sit under his pastoral ministry because I think he was very gentle in the way that he cared for people who were suffering in his congregation.
That brings to mind, what do you think are some of the things that are not helpful as we try to support our friends who are facing depression, or things that the church probably would do well to heed that are not helpful in this whole matter of depression?
I think, so I ironically enough wrote a blog post at one point about things not to say to people in pain, a lot of which I think are applicable to depression. One of the first ones I think of, just because it has done so much damage, is leading the conversation with a quick spiritual fix, right? Sometimes people hear, if you just prayed more, you wouldn't be depressed. Or if you just read your Bible more, or if you just had more faith, if you just chose joy, you wouldn't be depressed. And I think that those of us who were depressed, we've probably already tried that. That's not how it works. And so, and that those sorts of suggestions put a lot of blame on somebody in a very vulnerable season of suffering. So I think those are not helpful, especially as lead-ins. Another one is the cure by favorite alternative medicine therapy. Um, Also, there's probably things that have been tried already, and just trying to put forth a quick fix right at the beginning isn't very helpful. Even things as simple as, well, why are you depressed? Your life is so great. Or why are you depressed? You just need to think about all the things that you're thankful for. And I think the reality with depression is it's a breakdown of our brains, and a lot of those things, they're good practices. They might be helpful practices, even in the midst of depression, but they're not going to cure us right away. And so I think I would encourage people in the church to focus first on just trying to be a good listener, trying to be compassionate. I think those questions are of, what does this feel like for you? What is the hardest part about this for you? And how can I support you in the midst of it? I think those would be really good starting points for us to be able to support and encourage people around us who are depressed.
Mm-hmm. You spoke earlier too about how so many people found help in the people that you wrote about through a combination of leaning into their own faith and a lot of the other physical practices, just engaging in social life and being with other people and getting out into nature and exercise and good self-care practices. But there's also a place for medical care, and you talk a lot about that in your book. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about that and how these other kinds of things, spiritual and just good health practices and so forth, and medical care really go together in caring for somebody who's depressed, or if you're facing depression.
I found it to be a great help to think about depression like I do other illnesses like diabetes or high blood pressure or high cholesterol. Because I think with any of those ailments, the reality is that we can set ourselves up for success by certain lifestyle things, right? So let's say my family has a history of heart disease, which it does. I know that I need to be diligent about exercising as I continue to get older, be careful about what I eat, know that I need to get checkups to pay attention to those things. And then at the end of the day, I may still just get the short end of the stick with my genes, and I might still have to take medication for that at some point. I think depression works in a similar way. We know genetics plays part of it. We know that there are certain lifestyle things or life circumstance things that could trigger a season of depression. And so we do the best that we can to take care of ourselves with some of those lifestyle things you said, like exercise and getting outside and engaging with our faith. But at the end of the day, those things might not be enough to keep us from suffering from depression. Similarly to some of those illnesses, I think if you're intent on taking care of your body, you know that this medication is a gift and it's something that I can receive as a gift from the Lord, but yet it doesn't give me license to just live however I want and abuse my body and just trust that medication to hold me up by itself. And so I think in a similar way to depression, some of us need medication to get us stable enough that we can start implementing some of those lifestyle things. But once we've stabilized to that level, I think they really do work in concert with each other. And having both of them at the same time allows each of them to work more fully and really help us take steps towards being well.
I wanted to think a little bit with you about the pandemic. There are one study of the Journal of the American Medical Association actually reports a tripling of reports of depression in this season. I saw another study that said that roughly 25% of 18 to 24-year-olds, sort of the college audience, as it were, have thought about suicide in the last month. And it's just apparent that the pandemic it's been hard for all of us. And it's been particularly hard in the areas of depression and sometimes in terms of suicidal ideation and so forth. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that and maybe even thoughts you have about that in terms of the lives that you studied and how they dealt with extenuating circumstances or whatever.
Yeah, it's a hard season. I saw, you said 3 times. I saw one study that was suggesting it may be as high as 4 times as many people struggling with depression right now, which is just staggering. And I'd encourage all of you watching, if you're not struggling with depression today, there are very good chances that other people around you are. So I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for that. I think it's a season of enduring uncertainty. It's a season where we're very isolated, and a lot of us are dealing with this kind of complex and prolonged grief. And that's a lot to bear, especially if we don't have language to express it, or even people around us, like going back to Martin Luther's advice of finding people to surround yourself with. Whenever we don't have people to process that with or help pull us out of that, it's really challenging. So thinking about the advice from the companions, I'll start with Martin Luther because I think that's the one that's the trickiest to apply. This, how do you flee solitude whenever you are in quarantine or need to isolate from other people? He has this great story about how whenever he's depressed and his mind is just running in circles, if he can't go spend time with a person, he would run out and spend time with his pigs. And so I think we might not be able to go spend time with people in person, although I think we can be creative about using technology to do some of that. But even for those of us who might have pets, right? Take your dog for a walk, and do that as an intentional thing, knowing that might be something to just provide a sense of tangible comfort of another warm-blooded being there with you. William Cooper got out and gardened a lot. He went for walks, he gardened, he wrote poetry. Those things were activities that kept him grounded in the goodness that was present with him, the very tangible goodness that he could be present to. That's something I've tried to incorporate during this season. We have a little garden in the back of our house, and my daughter loves to dig in the dirt with me. And so on bad days, sometimes we'll just go outside and we'll dig in the dirt. And there's something about that that's really soothing. I think the other thing I think of that may not come specifically from one of them is just showing ourselves some grace that it's okay to struggle. I think I'll speak for myself. I know I hold myself to a pretty high standard. I'm an Enneagram 1 for any of you that are into the Enneagram. And so just making it a specific, very mindful practice of showing some grace to myself, that I don't need to be running at full steam all the time, that it's okay to struggle, it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to receive help and encouragement from other people around me, even if it's from afar.
That's good. That's good. Hey, did you have a favorite character of those you studied? Or maybe you don't want to offend any of them, but
ironically enough, it was William Cooper. I say ironically because I think his is the saddest story in this book.
Yeah.
But there was just some kind of warmth to him that I really appreciated. He would write little poems to his friends. He had a great sense of humor in spite of his depression. I think part of also what I connected with was he was a writer, and he talked about how the process of writing for him was his best remedy in the face of depression. And that's something that I can relate to, even in the practice of writing this book. I feel like writing a book about depression has kept me from deep seasons of depression over the last several years. And so maybe that's what it was. Maybe I saw that in my own life, even as I saw it in his.
Yeah. I did think that was one of the saddest stories. In many ways, he really struggled and worked hard to overcome. what he was feeling. Well, we're going to take a little bit of a break here, and I want to remind people we're going to go into an audience question and answer time in a few minutes. And so if you have questions, this is the time to be jotting them into the chat. Meanwhile, I'm going to introduce Diana's book to us all. Um, The book is Companions in the Darkness, 7 Saints Who Struggled with Depression and Doubt. And for all of you who are on this call, InterVarsity Press, who's been a great partner with us on these conversations, is offering the book at a 30% discount. And you can order it at the InterVarsity Press website, Companions in the Darkness. And when you're in the checkout, use the discount code GFMWeb21, GFMWeb21. And we'll put the link and the discount code in the chat for you. So you can go ahead and get a copy of the book. It just came out today. You know, maybe if you all go and order the book, it'll help Diana have great first day sales of her book, which would be lovely, because I read it. It's such a, Diana, one of the secrets about this book is that Diana just writes very well. And it's a book that just flows and very readable. And she does a marvelous job of weaving the stories of these saints and the realities of depression together. So I'd encourage you to go pick that up from InterVarsity Press. Well, now we're going to go into some question and answer time. And I see we've got one question in the chat, and please others join in. So the first question in the chat was from Penny, and she asks, do you think that particular theological beliefs could trigger depression? Was there any of this evidence of this in your research? It's a great question.
That is an excellent question. And I think for the pastoral sorts among us, it's a really important one. The person that I think of with that question is David Brainerd. His story might be of interest to you. I hesitate to use the word trigger, but I will use the word exacerbate when it comes to depression. So there's a biography that says that from an early age, he was very introspective and critical and prone to depression. And yet some of his mentors encouraged him to engage in very sobering, solitary religious practices, which, again, going back to the advice of Martin Luther, he might have had different advice for David Brainerd. I also see he uses very harsh language about himself. There's one line that I will never forget where he's about to go preach, and he says, "I pity the congregation that they should have to hear a dead dog like me preach." And what's really difficult, and this is where I think that interplay between our theology and our mental health is really worth taking a look at. It is impossible at times to draw the line between what is his depression speaking and what is his theology speaking that would encourage him to have in the name of humility, I think it was with good intention, but in the name of humility, to think of himself as just a worm and completely unworthy, completely self-abasing in his view of himself. And so in that sense, I don't think, did his theology trigger his depression? Probably not, but it certainly didn't push back against it at times. Whereas if he had had people in his life saying, yes, you're a sinner, but you're also beloved. You're a part of the beloved and you are forgiven. I think that kind of balance to his theology would really have helped him. So I think if we're a part of a theological tradition that only pushes us towards cycling feelings of guilt and shame without also pointing us to grace, and the fact that we are a part of the beloved. I think it's worth reevaluating that spirituality.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Well, we're still waiting on some more questions, but in the meanwhile, I'll ask you another one of mine. Talk a little about Mother Teresa. Because I think one of the most astonishing things that I think most people didn't find and learn about until after she died was her experience of just the absence of God, kind of feeling like she worked in the darkness in many ways. I wonder if you might say a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah, no, her experience wasn't known even by those who worked the closest with her during her life until several years after her death. There's a volume, if it's of interest to you, it's called Come Be My Light. And it's the book that revealed a lot of these internal struggles of hers to the world. It's a book of letters to some of her closest spiritual advisors. And as you said, Baba, it tells the story of this internal darkness that she experienced. Some might call it a dark night of the soul. It's impossible to know if it was clinical depression just because we don't have enough information. But around the time that she left the first religious order she was a part of to found the Missionaries of Charity, which was the work that she became most well known for, it was as if the lights went out in her spiritual life. She said she felt like she couldn't pray. She said, the space in my soul for God is blank. And it felt like God had just abandoned her in the midst of starting out on this great work. And that was how she felt for the rest of her life. So all of this work that she did of pouring herself for others and just exuding love and joy in her heart, she said inside she felt like an ice block. And so regardless of whether she was clinically depressed, I know in my own experience and that of others I've talked to who struggle with depression, that sense of our souls being an ice block and not being able to pray and not feeling like we can sense God's presence with us is something that we can relate to. And that's part of why I wanted to include her story in the book.
I'm really glad you did. It was it's a wonderful story. Okay, we have another one, another question here. If you had a chronically depressed spouse or loved, how would you pray and support them properly?
That is a hard road to walk. I think one of the things that I would say is it's important to try to encourage them to get treatment. Sometimes that can be a challenge in and of itself, but certain tasks of seeking treatment can be really overwhelming when you're depressed. If you've never had to look for a counselor on your own, it's very overwhelming. And there's a good chance statistically that the first counselor you see might not be one that you connect with. And so to then go find another counselor can be really daunting. And so things like that, any barriers you can remove to help your loved one be able to seek treatment, to get an appointment with their doctor, to remember to take their medications, to find a therapist that they can connect with is a really good starting point. A second thing I would say is don't do it alone. I think a lot of us can get lulled into something kind of akin to a savior complex or shame that we don't want to share, but finding other trusted friends that you can ask for support, building a support network around your spouse or your loved one so you're not the only one that's trying to care for them, and possibly finding a counselor for yourself or a trusted spiritual advisor to be able to process through that and pray with you through that, I think would be really important. And the third thing I would say is just be patient. Recovering from depression is a marathon and not a sprint, and it will probably come in fits and starts. There will probably be moments you're really frustrated along the way. So just try to have the mentality of being in it for the long haul. And again, build the supports around yourself to be able to walk through that with the stamina that you and your loved one are going to need.
Another person asks, which companion was the most difficult to research?
Oh, I have to think about that one for a minute. That's an interesting question. I think the hardest one was probably Martin Luther King Jr.
Hmm.
And that is because I think there is ample evidence that he did struggle with depression, but it is not something that he spoke about publicly. And it is not something, at least to my knowledge, that we have access to, something that he spoke much about in a preserved written form, privately, even in letters or things like that. And so there are snippets throughout major biographies written by him. There are bits from some of his close friends and advisors that were other leaders with him in the civil rights movement. There was a great documentary put together by HBO a couple of years ago called King in the Wilderness, which focuses specifically on that last year and a half of his life, whenever he became one of the most hated men in America.
Mm.
And they have some great interviews in there with people who were walking through that season with him about the depression that was playing out in his own life. But it's challenging to try to do responsible historical work and writing while also trying to piece together stories from a variety of sources. So I would say that was the most challenging, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, here's another one. Can you share more about Hannah Allen's story, her background, and what happened to her?
We don't know. We know that she grew up in the town was Snellston, I believe. Her father died when she was young. We know that she went to school in London and lived with several of her family members there. But the end of her story is just her recovering from depression. She tells us that she marries again after her recovery, and by her account, it seems like they had a nice life together. We know that she had a son with her first husband, so this little boy was walking with her through her intense seasons of depression. But after she tells us about her second marriage, that's where the story drops off, and we don't actually know that much more about her. So she's a little bit of an enigma in that sense. Yeah, if there's a more specific question, I'm happy to answer it, but we don't actually know that much about her.
Yeah, yeah. We hope she lived happily ever after.
I hope so, yes.
Yeah, yeah. You know, King was interesting too, because it sounded like he actually had I think you mentioned in the book that he had at one point been advised by a doctor to seek psychiatric care, and had not been because of the stigma at the time, and particularly the efforts to discredit him as a leader in the civil rights movement. You know, and you wrote about just some of the other ways that he really compensated and drew upon on the Black church. I thought that was marvelous. You might say a little more about that.
Yeah, that all really fell into place for me. I had the privilege of talking with a seminary professor of mine, Dr. Patrick Smith. He's now at Duke Divinity School. And I think it was his uncle actually knew Dr. King. And just became apparent to me that there was this, I refer to it as kind of a resilience reservoir, right? There's been a lot of research done on what makes us resilient. And I couldn't help but notice that a lot of that had just been cultivated by the culture that he grew up in the Black church. And I think for some of us, resilience is some of us have been gifted with things that just come to us instinctually. Some of us have that cultivated by the culture that we grow up in, and some of us have to piece it together as we go along. And I think for him, there were some things that were just, I don't want to say handed to him, but handed to him in some ways. So one of them is just the legacy of music. The spirituals were a comfort and a source of resilience to Black Americans who were enslaved, and they became again a source of resilience and hope to Black Americans in the midst of the civil rights movement. And so singing songs like there's one that the chorus just says, "No, never alone, no, never alone. He's promised never to leave us alone." And singing a song like that back to yourself again and again and again, I think has a lot of power to work within us internally. There's a couple stories, one in particular that I include in the book, where there was a day where he couldn't get out of bed. He was supposed to go with two little girls to an elementary school, and he was just too depressed and exhausted. And so one of his friends went and got the folk singer Joan Baez, and she came and started singing, "I am a poor pilgrim of sorrow."
Hmm.
And by the end of the song, he got up and he got ready and he went about his business. So I think in that sense, the music that was an inheritance of the Black church really spoke to him. Obviously, I've not done a ton of research into his work, but James Cone has that famous book about spirituals and the blues that goes into some of that, about the importance of the spirituals giving people the strength to face hell itself and still have a source of hope in the midst of it. And I think we see that play out in King's life.
I sing in a local choral group, and led by a Black director. And he does a lot of spirituals, and he takes us into the setting of them, and you really do see that, and you see how that could have just lifted people and helped them to continue to press forward in what was a very, very hard time. Yeah, yeah. One of the things I would encourage, again, we still have a little bit of time, and if there are others who have questions, please drop them into the chat. We'd love to give you a chance to interact with Diana that way. I was struck by just the many faces of depression in your book. That depression doesn't look the same with everybody, it seems. And I wondered if you could talk about that, and to talk about some of the different ways that depression seemed to express itself in the lives of the people that you studied.
I think that's a helpful thing to notice about depression, just because whenever we look at a list of symptoms, I think it's easy to overlook somebody who might be depressed just because they don't fit the normal picture. So for some people, something like anger is a lot more prominent than in others. Some people, depending on just their body and even the culture they come from, physical symptoms might be more prominent than some of the more traditional depressed symptoms. So I think knowing that it can look a little more complex than just that list of symptoms is really important.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned with Hannah Allen, some of them, there was a really strong religious bent to their depression. William Cooper was in a similar form like that. Some of them, it became so crippling, they couldn't get out of bed, they couldn't work, they couldn't do anything. Whereas some of them were still able to keep stumbling through life and doing it, even if it was to a limited degree. Some of them, it was long and very, long endurance stretches of depression. And some of them, it was very episodic, a couple months at a time. And so I think knowing that diversity for both for ourselves and as we're trying to notice depression in the lives of our loved one can be helpful to know that it can be a complex battle.
Yeah. Well, we did get a few more questions. Renee was curious about what your plans are for your next book. Is there a next book on the way?
I hope there's a next book. There are no specific plans in place. I think we have to see how this one goes, but I caught the bug. I would like to do this again. So I will just tell you one thing I'm interested in researching, and we'll see if it turns into a book. I have my degrees in spiritual formation. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what spiritual formation and discipleship look like practically. And so thinking about a struggle like depression, and it comes up throughout the different stories in this book, the spiritual life feels different when you're depressed. And some of the traditional spiritual disciplines that we use or encourage other people to use don't work, if I can use that language, in the same way. They don't have the same feel to them. We can't engage in long drawn out Bible study when we can't concentrate and we don't have the mental energy. So thinking about what kinds of spiritual practices would be helpful and realistic for people to engage in when they're in a season of depression. So
Hmm.
that may be as much a book, again, for my own needs as other people's, but it is something that's intrigued me and something I'd like to research more. So we'll see. Maybe that will turn into a book.
Well, it sounds like a great topic and an interesting insight for us to think about here. Someone else asks, which do you think is the most dangerous, damaging form of depression for Christians, and why?
I wish I could ask more about that question. The most dangerous and damaging form of depression. I mean, I think.
I don't know if the.
Sorry, dangerous or damaging form. Basically, I'm trying to understand. There's many different forms of depression, and they all affect people in different ways. But the Christians, being that we believe in the Lord Jesus and God above, knowing that He does all things for good, but then not being able. And is there a form of depression where it just destroys that walk with God, or destroys that person from the inside and makes it really difficult for that person to walk with God?
Listening to you elaborate that a little more, I think of all words that say, what can separate us from the love of God? Depression cannot separate us from the love of God. Depression cannot quench the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. I've been reflecting a lot on the words of Psalm 139, which I've never really thought of in terms of depression until just recently. In the middle of that psalm, he says, if I go up to the heavens, you are there. And if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. And if I say, surely the darkness will hide me, even the darkness is not dark to you. And I think as Christians, part of the pain, and I'll just speak from my own experience, part of the pain of depression is feeling like we are separated from God, or we are failing, or He has abandoned us. And I think one of the great hopes of our faith, and something that I think is worth just preaching back to ourselves, is that depression does not separate us from God. And no matter how deep and dark that experience becomes, He is the God who keeps company with us in the dark. And so in that sense, there is no depression that is the most dangerous to our spiritual life, because God has promised to walk with us through the valley. And I think sometimes we can preach that back to ourselves, and other times we need people in the community of faith around us to preach it back to us whenever we're inclined to forget it. Because that's something, even if we don't feel it, I really believe will carry us through.
Another person asked here, is Jesus' experience in the garden the night before his crucifixion depression or something else?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer to that, but what I will say is I think one of the most common questions that I hear from people is, how can Christians be depressed if one of the fruit of the Spirit is joy? I think this is one of the things that come up when people wrestle with whether or not depression is a sin. And when I think about that question, I think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, stretched out on the ground, weeping, just in internal turmoil and agony, sweating blood. And if Jesus was full of the Spirit and fully exhibiting those fruits of the Spirit at all times and in all places, then in that place, in the garden, there was joy. Which makes me think maybe we need to re-examine what the picture of joy is that we have. Because was he depressed? I don't know. I don't think so. But I have felt in a similar way, right? Spread out, saying, God, if there is any other way, please take this away from me. But I think the key there is that little word, not my will, but your will, right? So I think when we're depressed and we're saying, God, please, if there's any other way, we're weeping, we're just laid out, to say, God, even though I can't see it, I still believe that you're with me and you're good. I think that is joy. And so I think that picture in the garden provides us with comfort and a better picture of what that might look like in the Christian life in a time of suffering.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was depression and suicide. Hannah Allen attempted suicide at one point, and what things would you say to us in terms of particularly being attuned to those who may be thinking about suicide and maybe have expressed something about wanting to die or whatever?
I encourage everybody to have the National Suicide Lifeline saved in their phones. That's something I have done. I think it's helpful to have it on hand. It's a 24/7 access line. You can access it via phone or chat, and you can have someone else call, or if you're with someone, you can call yourself and they can help you walk through it. That's just one practical thing. One thing I would say that is often misunderstood is it's not going to, asking explicitly about suicide or suicidal ideation does not seem to incline people towards suicide more than not saying anything. If anything, it has the opposite effect. So if there's someone that you think might be struggling with thoughts of suicide, or you're seeing some warning signs of them, putting their affairs in order, talking about death, saying, that they think that it would be better off if they weren't around, things like really isolating themselves, things like that, don't be afraid to ask about it explicitly. That will often provide an opportunity for conversation with them. And then if they do express a desire to harm themselves and they have a plan for it and those types of things, don't hesitate to call either that lifeline, or if they're in very imminent threat to themselves or others, to call 911. They may not be thrilled with you in the moment, but that could be life-saving for them.
We've posted that National Suicide Hotline number in the chat if you want to copy that down. I think that's really, really important.
And if I could, Bob, I'll add one more thing to what I said. I think from a preventative standpoint, one of the great ideas I have heard, and if any of you are working, especially with young people, with students, adults too, is creating a hope kit, is what I've heard it referred to. So I think with a lot of these things, keeping it tangible can be really helpful. So get an actual box of some sort, a shoebox maybe. And I think one of the important things to realize with suicide is it's not usually that somebody wants to die, it's that the process of trying to keep living is too overwhelming to them. And so when we're talking about suicide, it's not just a matter of a theology of not dying, but a theology or a hope of why life is worth living. And so putting into that box tangible reminders of why life is worth living. And I said this is preventative. A lot of times when people are in that low point, that's not a time that they can put things into that box because they might not have a vision for it. But preventatively, helping someone create a hope kit so that when they're feeling in that low point, they can pull out these tangible reminders, maybe notes or pictures or things that remind them of people and things, places, dreams, experiences that make life worth living for them. So that in that crisis moment, they might be able to walk through that and look through that with somebody else. I've heard that advised by different people in the past, and I personally think that's a great idea.
Renee Gutierrez commented, I was recently advised just to ask straight out, are you planning on killing yourself? Instead of what I used to use, are you thinking of hurting yourself or someone else? I've also found that asking very directly actually is really important, and people will often really actually are appreciative that you've picked up on the signals.
Yeah.
Hawning just was asking about William Cooper's story. What did he and others do that were not helpful? What was helpful for him?
He found a lot of comfort through his art. He was a poet, and he once called poetry his greatest remedy in the face of depression. So writing was a great comfort to him. There were times when he couldn't write, whenever the depression became so deep. But as soon as he could, again, he would write. And that was both a sign of his recovery and also a partner in his recovery. The other thing I think of with William Cooper is the people that surrounded him. He had some great friends. He was really good friends with John and Mary Newton. John Newton, you may recognize his name.
Yes, yes, yes.
He wrote Amazing Grace, the hymn Amazing Grace. He and his wife Mary were very good friends with William Cooper. And there's one story where Cooper was very depressed and couldn't get out of bed. And then one day out of the blue, he got up, he walked across the garden that connected their two properties, showed up at their house in very deeply in a mental health crisis, and he didn't leave for 18 months. And he attempted suicide at least once while he was there. He was very low, and they just welcomed him into their home, and they took care of him, and they loved him, and they just kept company with him until he recovered. He had another friend who knew he had been hearing voices that spoke a lot of condemnation, and Cooper believed that they were real. And so this friend knew that he couldn't convince Cooper that the voices weren't real, so he thought he'd try to counteract them with voices of hope. So he installed this elaborate system of tubing through the wall in his home where Cooper was staying, and hired somebody that Cooper wouldn't recognize their voice to stand at the bottom speaking words of hope and comfort in the hope that they would maybe counteract those voices. And so thinking about Cooper and really all the people in this book, they survived and they left us the legacy they did because they had people surrounding them and supporting them and willing to love them through really difficult times. And so I think it's an encouragement to any of you who are walking with a loved one through depression that what you're doing is making a difference. And for those of us who do walk through seasons of depression, I thank God for the people who have walked alongside me during those deep seasons of darkness in my own life.
Boy, that is a super note to end on. The hour has flown. This has been delightful, Diana. Thank you so much. Well, we want to
Thanks for having me, Bob.
It's been fun. It's been fun. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, we want to just highlight Diana's book one more time. I hope you'll all go out and buy it. You've just heard a smidgen of the good things that Diana has in this book. And so I'd encourage you to pick up a copy at InterVarsity Press, Companions in the Darkness. And if you when you go to checkout, use GFM Web 21 and they'll give you a 30% discount. We also want to let you know about our next conversation, which is going to be on December 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Antipas L. Harris is the president and dean of Jake's Divinity School and serves on the pastoral staff at the Potter's House in Dallas, Texas. And he's going to be talking about his recent book, Is Christianity the White Man's Religion? How the Bible is Good News for People of Color. Perhaps you have heard this criticism lodged and a way of dismissing the Christian faith for people of color. And Antipas has written a wonderful book addressing those concerns and actually showing how the Bible is a book that arises actually from people of color and for people of color, for all people. And you can register now for that conversation at tinyurl.com/AL Harris. And we've already posted that link in the chat. If you want to copy that, you can register today. We would love to have you join us. Well, in conclusion, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this conversation hosted by the Emerging Scholars Network. Thank you, Diana. Thank you for all who have joined us. I do want to acknowledge InterVarsity Press, who has been a wonderful partner with us in hosting these conversations, and Krista Clayton, particularly for her work in publicity, but for her whole team. If you want to find out more about future conversations, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESN IVCF. Also, we have a YouTube channel that you can access via tinyurl.com/ESN YouTube with all of our recordings since July of this year. And this recording, this conversation will be online within a couple days. So you'll be able to pass it along to your friends, and we hope you will share it widely. So with that, I'm going to close our conversation. We will end our recording. And if